I never thought my own son would lock me out of my house on Christmas Eve, leaving me standing in the freezing rain with nothing but the clothes on my back and 40 years of memories scattered across the porch like broken ornaments. But Robert forgot one crucial detail when he changed those locks and threw my belongings into garbage bags. I'm the one whose name is on the deed. My name is Mae Thompson, and at 73 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of betrayal life could throw at me. I was wrong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Victorian house on Maple Street in Riverside had been my sanctuary for 42 years, every creaking floorboard and peeling paint chip telling the story of a life well lived. Frank and I had bought it in 1982 when Robert was just 8 years old, scraping together every penny for the down payment while I worked double shifts at the county hospital and Frank pulled overtime at the railroad yard. The house wasn't much to look at then, but we saw potential in its high ceilings and wraparound porch, the kind of home where children could grow up safe and loved, where grandchildren might someday play in the backyard under the old oak tree Frank had planted the day we moved in. Frank always said that house was our legacy, our proof that two kids from nothing could build something lasting. We'd spent decades restoring it room by room, painting every wall ourselves, refinishing the hardwood floors on weekends, turning a neglected old house into a home that made neighbors stop and admire its charm. When Frank passed 3 years ago from lung cancer, leaving me alone with nothing but his toolbox and 40 years of shared memories, that house became more than my home. It became my lifeline, the only constant in a world that suddenly felt foreign and empty. Robert had always been my pride and joy, the kind of son who called every Sunday and never forgot my birthday. After his father died, he started visiting more frequently, bringing his wife Jennifer and their 2 children, Emma and Tyler, for Sunday dinners that filled the house with laughter and reminded me that life still held moments of happiness. Jennifer seemed nice enough, though I sometimes caught her looking around the house with calculating eyes, commenting on the neighborhood's rising property values, or suggesting that maintaining such a large house might be too much for someone my age. The first hint of trouble came last October when Robert approached me about moving into a senior living community. He'd researched several facilities, he said, places where I'd have company and wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance. The suggestion came wrapped in concern for my well-being, but something in his tone made my stomach tighten with unease. This house was too big for me now, he argued, too expensive to maintain, too isolated for someone who might need help in an emergency. Wouldn't I be happier somewhere with people my own age, somewhere with activities and social opportunities? I told him I appreciated his concern but had no intention of leaving the home Frank and I had built together. The house might be large, but every room held memories I wasn't ready to abandon. The kitchen where Frank had taught me to make his mother's apple pie recipe, the living room where we'd watched Robert take his first steps, the bedroom where Frank had died holding my hand while we looked out at his oak tree one last time. Those memories weren't portable, couldn't be packed in boxes and transported to some sterile facility where strangers would decide when I ate and slept and lived. Robert's visits became more frequent after that conversation, but they felt different somehow, purposeful, rather than casual. He'd walk through the house pointing out problems I'd never noticed, a loose banister here, a water stain there, evidence that I was letting the property deteriorate. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jennifer started suggesting modifications that would make the house safer for an elderly person. Grab bars in the bathroom, ramps instead of stairs, medical alert systems that could summon help if I fell. Their concern felt suffocating, like being slowly strangled by love that had somehow transformed into control. The breaking point came 3 weeks before Christmas, when I overheard a phone conversation Robert was having with Jennifer in my kitchen. I'd gone upstairs to get photo albums to show Emma and Tyler pictures of their grandfather, and Robert's voice carried clearly through the old heating vents. He was discussing real estate values and market timing, talking about my house like it was already his property, planning renovations that would maximize its resale value. The casual way he dismissed my attachment to the house referring to my emotional connection as sentimental nonsense that's keeping her from making practical decisions, made my blood run cold. When I confronted him about the conversation, Robert became defensive, insisting he was only trying to help me plan for my future. But his explanation felt hollow, full of corporate buzzwords about asset management and financial responsibility that sounded like he'd been rehearsing them. He kept emphasizing how much money the house was worth, how selling it would give me financial security for my remaining years, how staying in such a large property was selfish when younger families needed homes. The word selfish hit me like a slap, coming from the son I'd sacrificed everything to raise, whose college education I'd paid for by taking on extra shifts that left me exhausted for years. Our relationship deteriorated rapidly after that confrontation. Robert's visits became tense affairs, where he'd find fault with everything from my housekeeping to my driving, building a case that I was no longer capable of independent living. Jennifer started bringing real estate brochures for senior communities, leaving them strategically placed around my kitchen table like propaganda designed to wear down my resistance. They'd cornered Mrs. Chen from next door at the grocery store, asking her whether she'd noticed any signs that I might be struggling, fishing for ammunition they could use to support their argument that I needed professional care. The manipulation was subtle but relentless. Robert would mention incidents that supposedly demonstrated my declining capabilities, times when I'd forgotten appointments I was certain I'd never made, confusion about conversations I was sure had never happened. He'd bring up my age in front of Emma and Tyler, making comments about how Grandma was getting forgetful, how we all needed to keep an eye on her to make sure she stayed safe. The children started looking at me with a mixture of pity and concern that broke my heart, as if I'd suddenly become fragile and unreliable in their eyes. Mrs. Chen became my unlikely ally during this period, the retired elementary school teacher who'd lived next door for 15 years and had witnessed Frank's final months with the clear-eyed compassion of someone who understood both love and loss. She'd noticed Robert and Jennifer's increasing presence at my house, their tendency to speak about me as if I weren't present, their habit of answering questions directed at me. Patricia had raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands, and she recognized manipulation when she saw it, even when it was disguised as filial concern. One afternoon in early December, Patricia knocked on my door with a plate of homemade cookies and a carefully worded warning. She'd seen Jennifer walking around my house with a notebook, measuring rooms and taking pictures like someone conducting a real estate assessment. More concerning, she'd overheard Robert on his phone in my driveway, discussing legal procedures for elderly people who could no longer make sound decisions for themselves. The words incompetency hearing and conservatorship had come up multiple times, legal concepts that made Patricia's teacher instincts flare with protective anger. That evening, I sat in Frank's old recliner with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands, staring at the deed to our house that I'd retrieved from the fireproof safe in our bedroom closet. The document was clear and unambiguous, my name listed as sole owner after Frank's death, with no mentions of Robert or anyone else having legal claim to the property. Frank had been meticulous about our estate planning, ensuring that I would have complete control over our assets if anything happened to him. The house was mine, legally and morally, yet somehow my own son was treating me like a tenant whose lease was about to expire. I started researching conservatorship laws at the public library, using their computers to understand the legal mechanisms Robert might employ to take control of my life and property. What I learned terrified me more than any diagnosis Dr. Martinez had ever delivered. With the right medical testimony and legal maneuvering, adult children could have their parents declared incompetent, stripping them of the right to make their own decisions about housing, finances, and medical care. The process was designed to protect vulnerable elderly people from exploitation, but it could just as easily be used by unscrupulous family members to steal inheritance while their parents were still alive. The research made me paranoid about every interaction with Robert and Jennifer, wondering whether their questions about my daily routine and social activities were innocent concern or evidence gathering for a legal case. I started keeping a journal, documenting every conversation and incident that might be twisted to support claims about my mental deterioration. The exercise made me realize how effectively they'd been gaslighting me, creating a narrative of decline that existed more in their words than in my actual experience. Christmas preparations that year felt like preparing for war rather than celebration. Robert had volunteered to host Christmas dinner at my house, A generous offer that would have touched me under different circumstances, but now felt like a territorial claim. Jennifer threw herself into planning the menu and decorations with an enthusiasm that seemed more about showcasing her domestic capabilities than creating holiday joy. They talked about the event as if it were happening in their house, making decisions about my space and my belongings without consulting me, treating me like a guest in my own home. The week before Christmas, strange things started happening around the house. I'd find windows unlocked that I was certain I'd secured, lights turned on in rooms I hadn't entered, my reading glasses moved from their usual spot on the kitchen table. When I mentioned these incidents to Robert, he exchanged meaningful glances with Jennifer and suggested that I might be experiencing the kind of memory problems that were common in people my age. Their patronizing concern made me question my own perceptions, wondering whether I really was becoming unreliable or whether someone was deliberately creating confusion to support their narrative about my declining mental state. 2 days before Christmas, I discovered that Robert had been intercepting my mail, collecting it from the box before I could retrieve it myself. When I confronted him, he claimed he was just trying to help with my correspondence, but I caught him sorting through bills and official documents like someone conducting an audit of my financial situation. The violation felt deeply personal, an invasion of privacy that crossed lines I'd never imagined my own son would cross. I changed the locks on my mailbox that afternoon, a small act of rebellion that felt like reclaiming a piece of my independence. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of cold, drizzling rain that made Riverside feel more like Seattle than Southern California. I'd spent the morning preparing for dinner, cooking Frank's favorite recipes, and setting the table with the good china we'd received as wedding gifts 50 years earlier. The house smelled like cinnamon and roast turkey, the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner of the living room where Frank used to read the paper every morning. For a few hours, I let myself believe that maybe I'd been overreacting, that Robert's concern really was motivated by love rather than greed. The family arrived at 4 o'clock, Emma and Tyler racing through the house with the boundless energy of children high on Christmas excitement, Robert and Jennifer carrying armloads of perfectly wrapped presents that they arranged under the tree, with magazine-worthy precision. Dinner was pleasant enough, filled with the kind of small talk that families use to avoid discussing difficult topics, everyone carefully avoiding the elephant in the room that had been growing larger with each passing week. After dinner, while the children played with their new toys and I loaded the dishwasher, I overheard Robert and Jennifer talking quietly in the dining room. Their voices carried the kind of urgency that made me stop washing dishes and listen more carefully. Jennifer was expressing concern about my living situation, pointing out signs of decline she'd observed during their visit, forgetfulness about recent conversations, confusion about the day's schedule, difficulty managing household tasks that had once been routine. Robert agreed that intervention was becoming necessary, that waiting longer would only make the eventual transition more difficult for everyone involved. The conversation that followed made my hands shake as I gripped the edge of the kitchen sink. They were discussing timeline for having me declared incompetent, strategies for convincing a judge that I could no longer care for myself safely, plans for selling the house once they had legal control of my assets. Jennifer mentioned a senior facility she'd toured, a place that would provide excellent care while allowing them to liquidate my property at the optimal market moment. They talked about my future like I was already gone, dividing up my life like a estate planner settling a will. When I returned to the living room with coffee and dessert, my family looked at me with expressions I couldn't quite read, a mixture of false cheer and calculated assessment that made me feel like a specimen under a microscope. Emma and Tyler were showing me their Christmas gifts with innocent enthusiasm, but Robert and Jennifer seemed distracted, exchanging glances that suggested they were communicating about something beyond my comprehension. The evening felt surreal, like attending my own funeral while still alive to witness the proceedings. Around 9 o'clock, I excused myself to use the bathroom, needing a moment alone to process what I'd overheard and decide how to respond. When I returned to the living room, I found Robert and Jennifer packing up the children's toys with unusual efficiency, as if they were preparing to leave earlier than planned. Robert announced that they needed to head home because Tyler had school the next day, a statement that confused me since Christmas fell on a Saturday and school was closed for winter break. As they gathered their coats and prepared to leave, Jennifer made an odd comment about how much she'd enjoyed spending Christmas in such a beautiful house, emphasizing the word house in a way that felt significant. Robert hugged me goodbye with what felt like finality, holding me longer than usual while whispering that he loved me and wanted me to be safe and happy. The words should have been comforting, but something in his tone made them sound like a goodbye that carried more weight than a simple end to Christmas dinner. After they left, I sat in the living room surrounded by wrapping paper and dirty coffee cups, feeling more alone than I had since Frank's funeral. The house felt different somehow, as if my family's presence had changed its essential character, marking it as territory that no longer fully belonged to me. I cleaned up the dinner dishes mechanically, my mind racing through the conversation I'd overheard and trying to understand what they might be planning. Around midnight, as I was turning off the Christmas lights and preparing for bed, I heard cars in my driveway. Through the front window, I could see Robert's SUV and another vehicle I didn't recognize, both parked as if their occupants were planning to stay for a while. My first thought was that someone had been in an accident or needed help, but something about the way the car doors closed with deliberate quiet made my stomach tighten with apprehension. The knock on my front door came at 12:15 a.m., 3 sharp raps that sounded official rather than casual. When I opened the door, I found Robert standing on my porch with 2 men I'd never seen before, both wearing suits despite the late hour and holding clipboards like salesmen or process servers. Robert's expression was carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask he wore during difficult business meetings, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes as he explained that they needed to discuss my living situation. The men introduced themselves as Dr. William Hayes, a geriatric psychiatrist, and Thomas Bradley, an attorney specializing in elder care law. They'd come to conduct what they called wellness check, based on concerns that had been brought to their attention about my ability to live independently. The evaluation would be brief, they assured me, just a few questions to ensure that I was managing my daily activities safely and making sound decisions about my care and finances. Standing in my own doorway at past midnight on Christmas morning, being asked to prove my competency to strangers my son had brought to my house without warning, I felt something inside me break apart and rearrange itself into something harder and more determined. Robert had orchestrated this moment carefully, choosing a time when I'd be tired and unprepared, surrounding me with authority figures who could testify about my apparent confusion and inability to understand the situation. It was an ambush disguised as concern, a betrayal wrapped in the language of love and protection. But Robert had made one crucial miscalculation in his carefully planned intervention. He'd forgotten that the house where he was trying to have me declared incompetent belonged to me, that the deed in my fireproof safe gave me rights he couldn't simply talk his way around, that 42 years of building a life and paying a mortgage had created legal protections he'd overlooked in his eagerness to control my future. As I stood there in my Christmas pajamas facing the son who'd betrayed me and the strangers he'd brought to strip away my independence, I realized that this moment would define everything that came after. I could surrender to their narrative of decline and dependency, or I could fight back with every tool and resource at my disposal. I chose to fight. I invited the 3 men into my living room, the Christmas tree lights casting strange shadows across their faces as they arranged themselves on my furniture like they owned the place. Dr. Hayes pulled out a tablet and began asking questions that seemed innocent enough at first. Could I tell him what day it was? Did I remember what I'd had for breakfast? Could I count backward from 100 by 7s? The questions felt like a test I hadn't studied for, designed to trip me up and prove some predetermined conclusion about my mental state. Robert sat in Frank's old chair, the one piece of furniture I'd asked him never to use because it still held the shape of his father's body and the memory of countless evenings spent reading together. Watching my son occupy that sacred space while strangers interrogated me in my own home felt like a violation so profound it took my breath away. He kept nodding encouragingly whenever Dr. Hayes asked a question, as if he were coaching me through an exam, but his eyes held a coldness I'd never seen before. The attorney, Bradley, focused on practical matters that revealed the true purpose of their visit. Did I manage my own finances? Had I been keeping up with house maintenance? Did I ever feel confused about daily tasks or forget important appointments? Each question felt like a trap, designed to elicit responses that could be twisted to support claims about my incompetence. When I mentioned that I sometimes had trouble reaching high shelves to change light bulbs, Bradley made a barfenemat note that seemed far more significant than the minor admission warranted. Jennifer appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee, moving through my house with the familiarity of someone who considered it her domain. She'd apparently been rummaging through my cabinets while the men conducted their evaluation, And I noticed she'd chosen my everyday mugs instead of the good china I saved for company. The small slight felt deliberate, a way of establishing that this wasn't a social visit worthy of my best hospitality. Dr. Hayes asked about my social connections and daily activities, questions that painted a picture of isolation and decline when filtered through his clinical perspective. Yes, I spent most evenings alone, but that was my choice after 40 years of marriage and a lifetime of caring for others. Yes, I sometimes went days without leaving the house, but I had groceries delivered and maintained friendships through phone calls and occasional visits. My contentment with solitude was reframed as concerning withdrawal, my preference for routine labeled as rigidity that might indicate cognitive decline. The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, each answer I gave somehow becoming evidence for whatever case they were building against my independence. When I mentioned that I'd been researching conservatorship laws at the library, Bradley and Dr. Hayes exchanged glances that suggested my initiative was actually proof of paranoid thinking. My perfectly reasonable desire to understand my legal rights was being twisted into evidence that I was obsessed with imaginary threats to my autonomy. Around 2 a.m, Robert finally revealed the true purpose of their visit. Based on the evaluation and their observations of my living situation, the professionals recommended immediate intervention to ensure my safety. I couldn't continue living alone in such a large house, managing complex financial responsibilities, making decisions that could affect my health and well-being. They'd identified several excellent facilities that specialized in caring for people in my situation, places where I'd have round-the-clock supervision and wouldn't have to worry about the burdens of homeownership. I listened to their recommendations with growing fury, watching my son nod along as strangers dismantled my life and repackaged it as a medical necessity. They talked about me as if I weren't sitting right there, discussing my limitations and needs like doctors planning treatment for a patient who couldn't advocate for herself. The condescension was breathtaking, the assumption that age automatically equaled incompetence so deeply ingrained in their thinking that they couldn't imagine an elderly woman capable of making informed decisions about her own life. When I finally spoke, my voice was steadier than I'd expected. I thanked them for their concern but explained that I had no intention of leaving my home or surrendering control of my finances to anyone. This house was legally mine, purchased with money Frank and I had earned through decades of hard work, and I had every right to live in it as long as I chose. Their evaluation was meaningless without my consent, and I was withdrawing that consent immediately. The reaction to my refusal was swift and revealing. Dr. Hayes began explaining the dangers of elderly people living alone, the statistics about falls and medical emergencies that went undetected for days. Bradley discussed the legal mechanisms available to protect vulnerable adults from their own poor judgment, procedures that could be initiated by concerned family members when safety became a paramount concern. Robert's mask of loving concern finally slipped, revealing frustration that I wasn't cooperating with their carefully orchestrated intervention. Jennifer returned from another expedition through my house, this time carrying a folder filled with what appeared to be documentation they'd been gathering during their visit. She'd photographed expired medications in my bathroom cabinet, noting that keeping outdated prescriptions was a sign of confusion about medical management. She documented dust on high shelves as evidence that I couldn't maintain the house properly, conveniently ignoring the fact that I'd hired a cleaning service specifically to handle tasks that were becoming physically challenging. The evidence they'd collected was thin but damaging when presented in the right context. A few forgotten pills became proof of medical noncompliance. Normal wear and tear on a 40-year-old house became evidence of dangerous neglect. My choice to have groceries delivered was reframed as inability to drive safely or manage shopping independently. They'd taken the ordinary challenges of aging and transformed them into a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. Dr. Hayes began discussing the process for initiating an emergency conservatorship, a legal procedure that could provide temporary protection while a more comprehensive evaluation was conducted. The language was clinical and compassionate, but the underlying threat was clear. If I didn't voluntarily accept their recommendations, they would pursue legal means to force compliance with their plans for my care and housing. I asked to see their credentials and legal authority to conduct this evaluation, a request that seemed to catch them off guard. Dr. Hayes showed me a license that looked legitimate, but Bradley's documentation was more vague, consisting of business cards and letterhead that could have been produced by anyone with access to a computer and printer. When I asked who had hired them and what gave them the right to enter my home and interrogate me, the answers became evasive and contradictory. Robert finally admitted that he'd contacted them after consulting with an attorney about options for elderly parents who were no longer capable of making sound decisions. He'd described my living situation and recent behavior, providing examples of confusion and poor judgment that had convinced these professionals that intervention was necessary. The fact that he'd been building a case against my competence for weeks, documenting my every mistake and limitation while pretending to offer loving support, felt like the deepest betrayal of all. Around 3 a.m, when it became clear that I wasn't going to cooperate with their plans, the tone of the conversation shifted from compassionate concern to barely concealed threats. Bradley explained that emergency conservatorships could be initiated based on imminent danger to the elderly person's health or safety. If I continued to resist reasonable accommodations for my declining capabilities, they might have no choice but to pursue court intervention to protect me from my own poor judgment. Dr. Hayes suggested that my refusal to accept help was itself evidence of the cognitive impairment they were trying to address. Healthy elderly people recognized their limitations and welcomed appropriate support, while those suffering from dementia or other cognitive disorders often displayed exactly the kind of stubborn resistance I was demonstrating. My perfectly rational desire to maintain my independence was being reframed as a symptom of the very condition they claimed to be treating. The circular logic was maddening and effective. Any argument I made in favor of my competence became evidence of my incompetence. My knowledge of conservatorship law was paranoid obsession. My insistence on staying in my own home was dangerous delusion. My anger at their manipulation was inappropriate emotional volatility. They'd created a framework where resistance proved guilt and cooperation was the only acceptable response. Jennifer had been unusually quiet during the final hour of their visit, but I caught her making phone calls from my kitchen, speaking in hushed tones about timelines and logistics. When she returned to the living room, she announced that she'd contacted the senior facility Dr. Hayes had recommended, and they had an opening available immediately. We could transport my essential belongings in the morning and handle the house sale once I was settled in my new accommodations. The presumption was staggering. They'd already decided where I would live and how my property would be disposed of, making arrangements for my life as if I were already under their legal control. The fact that I hadn't agreed to any of their plans seemed irrelevant to their timeline, a minor obstacle they expected to overcome through persistence and professional authority. I stood up from my chair, my legs shaky with exhaustion and adrenaline, and told them I needed to use the bathroom before we continued our discussion. The request seemed reasonable enough, and they agreed to wait while I attended to my personal needs. But instead of going to the bathroom, I went to my bedroom and retrieved the deed to my house from the fireproof safe, where Frank had always kept our important documents. When I returned to the living room carrying the legal proof of my ownership, the atmosphere changed immediately. I spread the deed across my coffee table and pointed to my name listed as sole owner of the property, legal documentation that trumped their psychological evaluations and professional recommendations. This house belonged to me, I explained, and I had the absolute right to live in it regardless of their opinions about my capabilities or judgment. The deed created complications they hadn't anticipated, legal obstacles that couldn't be dismissed through medical testimony or family concern. Bradley studied the document carefully, looking for loopholes or technicalities that might undermine my ownership rights. He asked about my understanding of property law and financial obligations, fishing for evidence that I was too confused to manage real estate responsibilities. But the deed was ironclad, Frank's careful planning creating protections that even determined adversaries couldn't easily overcome. My ownership was clear and unambiguous, with no cosigners or contingencies that would allow others to claim authority over my property decisions. The house was mine, legally and completely, and that legal reality created a foundation of power they couldn't simply talk their way around. Robert's frustration became more obvious as he realized their carefully planned intervention had encountered an unexpected obstacle. He'd assumed that his relationship as my son would give him some kind of inherent authority over my decisions, that family connection would trump legal documentation. The discovery that I understood my rights and had access to the documents that protected them clearly hadn't been part of his strategy. Dr. Hayes attempted to argue that property ownership didn't necessarily indicate competence to live independently, that many elderly people retained legal rights while lacking the practical ability to exercise them safely. But his arguments felt weaker now, less convincing when confronted with concrete evidence of my legal status and preparation for exactly this kind of challenge. Around 4 in the morning, the three men finally accepted that their intervention wasn't proceeding according to plan. They'd expected to find a confused, isolated elderly woman who could be easily convinced to accept their recommendations for her own good. Instead, they'd encountered someone who understood her rights, had access to legal documentation, and was prepared to fight for her independence. Bradley left his business card and explained that the legal options for protecting elderly people from their own poor judgment were more extensive than I might realize. Courts had broad authority to intervene when family members could demonstrate that an elderly person's decisions posed risks to their health, safety, or financial security. My ownership of the house was just one factor that would be considered in evaluating my overall competence to manage my affairs. Dr. Hayes made notes about my defensive posture and inappropriate attachment to property that would undoubtedly become part of his professional assessment. My completely reasonable insistence on my ownership rights was being documented as evidence of the cognitive rigidity and poor judgment they claimed to be addressing. The system was rigged to turn any response I made into proof of whatever conclusion they'd already reached. As they prepared to leave, Robert made one final attempt to convince me to reconsider their recommendations. He spoke about his love for me and his fear that something terrible would happen if I continued living alone in such a large house. His words might have been touching under different circumstances, but knowing what I'd overheard about their financial motivations made his expressions of concern feel like manipulation wrapped in emotional blackmail. The three men finally left my house as dawn was breaking over Riverside, their cars disappearing down Maple Street like retreating army. I stood in my doorway watching them go, still wearing my Christmas pajamas and feeling like I'd just survived the first battle of a war. One hadn't known I was fighting. I locked the door behind them and leaned against it, my heart pounding with the adrenaline of confrontation and the terrible knowledge that this was just the beginning. Robert and his allies had revealed their intentions clearly enough. They wanted control of my house and my life, and they were prepared to use any legal or medical means necessary to achieve their goals. But they'd also revealed something else in their retreat. They'd underestimated me, assumed that age and widowhood had made me vulnerable and easily manipulated. The deed in my hand proved otherwise. Legal documentation that Frank's careful planning had created to protect exactly the kind of situation I now faced. As Christmas morning light filled my living room, illuminating the wrapping paper still scattered around the tree where my grandchildren had played just hours earlier, I realized that everything had changed. The family I'd trusted had become adversaries, the home I'd built had become a battleground, and the independence I'd taken for granted had become something I'd have to fight to preserve. But I wasn't defenseless, and I wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen had been watching from her window during the strange midnight visit, and I was certain she'd want to know what had transpired. More importantly, I had legal rights that couldn't be dismissed through manipulation or professional authority. Robert had forgotten that the grandmother he was trying to control had spent 40 years building something he couldn't simply take away. The house on Maple Street was mine, and I intended to keep it that way. The week following Christmas felt like living in enemy territory. Robert called every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, his voice dripping with artificial concern as he asked about my night's sleep and whether I'd taken my medications properly. The conversations felt like interrogations disguised as wellness checks, each question designed to elicit responses that could be used against me later. When I mentioned that I'd slept poorly after their midnight visit, he immediately suggested that anxiety and sleep disturbance were common symptoms of age-related cognitive decline. Jennifer had taken to driving by my house at odd hours, slowing down to peer through my windows like a detective gathering surveillance footage. I caught her photographing my front porch one afternoon, focusing on the peeling paint around the doorframe and the loose step I'd been meaning to repair since Frank's death. When I confronted her about it, she claimed she was simply documenting maintenance issues that might pose safety hazards, as if my own porch had suddenly become a public safety concern requiring her oversight. Mrs. Chen knocked on my door 3 days after Christmas, carrying a casserole and wearing the expression of someone who'd witnessed something disturbing. She'd seen the cars in my driveway that night, heard raised voices through my windows, watched strange men leave my house in the early morning hours. Her teacher instincts had been triggered by Robert and Jennifer's behavior during their recent visits. The way they spoke about me rather than to me. Their habit of answering questions directed at me as if I couldn't speak for myself. Patricia had also noticed the pattern of surveillance that had developed around my house. Robert's car parked across the street for hours at a time. Jennifer's frequent drive-bys, unfamiliar vehicles that seemed to be monitoring my comings and goings. The attention felt oppressive and invasive, like being under house arrest in my own neighborhood. Patricia offered to document the surveillance activity, creating a record that might be useful if the situation escalated to legal proceedings. The psychological pressure was relentless and sophisticated. Robert would call with urgent concerns about news stories he'd heard about elderly people dying alone in their homes, victims of falls or medical emergencies that went undetected for days. He'd forward articles about home invasions targeting senior citizens, statistics about financial fraud schemes that preyed on isolated elderly women. Each communication was designed to increase my anxiety and make me question the safety of living independently. Dr. Hayes called to schedule a follow-up evaluation, explaining that my resistance to their initial recommendations was concerning enough to warrant additional assessment. He'd consulted with colleagues who specialized in geriatric psychology, and they'd agreed that my defensive behavior and attachment to maintaining independence despite obvious safety concerns suggested possible cognitive impairment that required professional intervention. The appointment was scheduled for the following Monday at my house, another home invasion disguised as medical care. Dr. Hayes explained that conducting the evaluation in my familiar environment would provide better insights into my daily functioning and decision-making capabilities. The real purpose was obviously to gather more evidence for whatever legal proceedings they were planning, documenting my living conditions and behavior in my own space where they could claim I was demonstrating poor judgment. I spent the weekend preparing for their return visit like a general planning defense strategy. I cleaned my house thoroughly, organized my medications, gathered financial documents that demonstrated my competent management of my affairs. I called my primary care physician, Dr. Martinez, to request copies of my medical records and recent test results that showed normal cognitive function for someone my age. If they wanted to question my mental capacity, I'd provide professional documentation that contradicted their assumptions. The breakthrough came Sunday evening when I was organizing Frank's old papers, looking for insurance documents that might be relevant to my defense. Buried in a box of tax returns and bank statements, I found the will and estate planning documents Frank had prepared 3 years before his death. The papers included not just our standard wills, but a comprehensive trust agreement that protected our assets from exactly the kind of legal challenges I was now facing. Frank had been more prescient than I'd realized, anticipating that our son might someday challenge my competence to manage our shared property. The trust documents included specific language about my mental capacity, requiring multiple independent medical evaluations before anyone could claim I was incompetent to manage the trust assets. More importantly, the trust had been designed to prevent family members from using conservatorship proceedings to gain control of our house and other property. Reading Frank's careful legal language felt like receiving a message from beyond the grave, his final gift of protection against exactly the betrayal I was now experiencing. The man who'd spent our marriage safeguarding our future had somehow anticipated that I might need legal weapons to fight our own son's greed. The trust documents were complex, but their basic message was clear. My ownership of our house was protected by legal mechanisms that couldn't be easily overcome through conservatorship proceedings. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp January clarity that made everything seem possible. I'd dressed carefully in the navy blue suit I'd worn to Frank's funeral, the outfit that made me feel most like the competent woman I'd been throughout my professional life. My hair was perfectly styled, my makeup subtle but polished, my demeanor calm and authoritative. If they wanted to evaluate my mental capacity, they'd find someone who looked and acted nothing like their stereotypes about confused elderly women. Dr. Hayes arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, this time accompanied by a different attorney and a woman who introduced herself as a social worker specializing in elder care assessments. The expanded team suggested they were escalating their efforts, bringing additional professional authority to support whatever conclusions they'd already reached about my competence. Robert and Jennifer arrived minutes later, their faces wearing expressions of concerned family members reluctantly participating in a necessary intervention. The evaluation began with the same kinds of basic questions they'd asked during their Christmas visit: cognitive tests designed to assess my memory, reasoning ability, and understanding of complex information. But this time I was prepared, responding to each question with the kind of detailed, thoughtful answers that demonstrated not just competence, but superior intellectual functioning for someone my age. When they asked about my daily routine, I provided a comprehensive overview of my activities that showed careful planning and self-management. The social worker, whose name was Barbara Stevens, focused on my living environment and support systems. She wanted to know about my social connections, medical care, financial management, and emergency planning. Each area of inquiry was designed to identify vulnerabilities that could be used to justify intervention, but I'd prepared documentation for every aspect of my independent living that demonstrated competent self-care and responsible decision-making. When Dr. Hayes asked about my understanding of the risks associated with living alone at my age, I pulled out the trust documents Frank had prepared and explained the comprehensive planning we'd done to address exactly those concerns. The legal protections Frank had created specifically anticipated challenges to my mental capacity, requiring multiple independent evaluations before anyone could claim I was incompetent to manage our property. The documents were professionally prepared and legally sophisticated, demonstrating planning that contradicted their assumptions about my judgment and foresight. The trust revelation clearly caught them off guard, introducing legal complexities they hadn't anticipated when planning their intervention. Barbara Stevens asked to examine the documents more closely, her expression growing increasingly concerned as she read Frank's careful language about protecting me from family members who might use conservatorship proceedings for financial gain. The social worker was experienced enough to recognize that the trust created significant obstacles to the kind of legal action Robert was apparently considering. Robert's reaction to the trust documents was immediate and revealing. His mask of loving concern slipped completely, replaced by frustration and anger that his plans had encountered unexpected resistance. He argued that the trust was outdated, created when I was younger and more capable of making sound decisions. The fact that Frank had died 3 years ago meant the documents might no longer reflect my current mental status or living needs. But Dr. Hayes was forced to acknowledge that the trust language specifically addressed those concerns, requiring current medical evaluations rather than relying on historical assessments. The documents Frank had prepared weren't just standard estate planning tools, but sophisticated legal protections designed by someone who understood both my character and the potential threats to my independence. The psychiatrist's own evaluation would need to contradict multiple safeguards that Frank had built into our estate planning. Jennifer had been unusually quiet during the morning evaluation, but she finally spoke up to express concerns about my social isolation and lack of family support. She pointed out that I had no close friends nearby, limited contact with neighbors, and refused to participate in senior activities that would provide appropriate social stimulation. My contentment with solitude was reframed as dangerous withdrawal that left me vulnerable to emergencies and poor decision-making. The attack on my social connections felt particularly cruel because it targeted my grief over Frank's death and my adjustment to widowhood. The quiet life I'd built for myself after losing my husband was being characterized as pathological isolation, requiring professional intervention. My preference for reading over bingo games, my choice to maintain friendships through phone calls rather than group activities, my satisfaction with my own company after 40 years of marriage were all being twisted into evidence of declining mental health. Mrs. Chen's unexpected arrival at 11:30 changed the entire dynamic of the evaluation. Patricia had been watching my house since early morning, concerned about the number of official-looking cars in my driveway and the serious expressions on the faces of the people entering my home. When she knocked on my door carrying a plate of homemade muffins and asking whether everything was all right, I invited her to join our conversation. Patricia's presence as a character witness was devastating to their case against my competence. She was articulate, observant, and completely convinced of my mental sharpness and independent living capabilities. As a retired teacher with 40 years of experience evaluating people's cognitive abilities, her professional opinion carried weight that was difficult to dismiss. She described specific examples of my good judgment, careful planning, and appropriate responses to the challenges of aging. More damaging to their narrative, Patricia had witnessed Robert and Jennifer's surveillance activities and could testify about their behavior over the past several weeks. She'd seen Jennifer measuring rooms and taking photographs, heard Robert discussing real estate values with contractors he'd brought to assess my property, observed the pattern of intimidation and manipulation they'd been using to pressure me into accepting their recommendations for my care. Dr. Hayes attempted to dismiss Patricia's observations as the opinions of a well-meaning neighbor who lacked professional training in geriatric assessment. But Barbara Stevens was clearly influenced by Patricia's testimony, recognizing that elderly people with strong community connections and neighbor support systems were far less vulnerable than isolated individuals. Patricia's involvement contradicted their claims about my social isolation and demonstrated that I had advocates who would notice and report any actual decline in my capabilities. The evaluation continued for another hour, but the momentum had shifted dramatically. The trust documents provided legal protections they couldn't easily overcome, while Patricia's testimony contradicted their assumptions about my isolation and vulnerability. Dr. Hayes's questions became more aggressive and leading, clearly frustrated that his assessment wasn't producing the results he'd expected when Robert first contacted him about my situation. The final confrontation came when Barbara Stevens asked directly about my understanding of the financial implications of maintaining my house versus moving to a care facility. I'd prepared for exactly this question, pulling out financial statements that showed my ability to afford home maintenance, property taxes, and necessary services while maintaining substantial savings for emergencies. The documentation proved that I wasn't being financially irresponsible by staying in my glass house, but rather making informed decisions based on careful analysis of my resources and needs. Robert finally exploded in frustration, abandoning any pretense of loving concern as he accused me of being stubborn and selfish. He argued that I was putting everyone in an impossible position by refusing to accept reality about my declining capabilities. The house was too much responsibility for someone my age, the neighborhood wasn't safe for elderly people living alone, and my insistence on maintaining independence was creating anxiety and worry for family members who cared about my welfare. The outburst was exactly what I'd been hoping for, revealing the true motivations behind their intervention. Robert wasn't concerned about my safety or well-being, but frustrated that I wouldn't cooperate with plans he'd made for my life and property. His anger at my resistance demonstrated that this was about control rather than care, financial planning rather than medical necessity. Jennifer tried to salvage the situation by returning to their original narrative about loving family members forced to make difficult decisions for my own protection. She spoke about the emotional toll of worrying about my safety, the sleepless nights spent imagining accidents or emergencies that might befall me in my isolated house. But her words felt hollow after Robert's angry revelation of his true feelings about my choices. Dr. Hayes completed his evaluation with obvious reluctance, clearly understanding that his assessment wouldn't support the kind of emergency intervention Robert had been seeking. The trust documents created legal obstacles that couldn't be overcome through simple psychiatric testimony, while Patricia's character witness testimony contradicted claims about my isolation and declining capabilities. His professional reputation depended on accurate assessments, and the evidence didn't support conclusions about my incompetence. The three professionals left my house around 2 o'clock, their departure feeling less like retreat than strategic withdrawal. They'd failed to achieve their immediate objectives, but I understood that this was likely just the first round of a longer battle. Robert's parting words made it clear that he wasn't giving up on his plans, but would need to find different strategies for gaining control of my property and life decisions. After they left, Patricia and I sat in my kitchen, drinking tea and processing what had just occurred. She was outraged by the manipulation and intimidation tactics my own family had employed, the way they'd tried to use professional authority to override my clearly expressed wishes about my living situation. As someone who'd spent decades protecting children from adults who didn't have their best interests at heart, she recognized similar patterns in the way Robert and Jennifer were treating me. I showed Patricia the trust documents Frank had prepared, explaining how his foresight had created legal protections I hadn't even known existed. The papers were complex, but their basic purpose was clear: preventing exactly the kind of family manipulation I was now experiencing. Frank had somehow anticipated that grief and age might make me vulnerable to people who confuse their desires with my needs. That evening, I called the attorney whose name appeared on Frank's trust documents, a man named Bill Henderson, who'd been Frank's friend since their railroad days and had helped us with estate planning throughout our marriage. Bill had retired from active practice, but agreed to review the current situation and advise me about the legal protections Frank had created. His voice was reassuring and knowledgeable, confirming that the trust was specifically designed to prevent conservatorship abuse by family members. Bill explained that conservatorship proceedings were indeed possible despite the trust protections, but the legal standards for proving incompetence were much higher when sophisticated estate planning was involved. Courts were reluctant to override carefully prepared legal documents unless there was overwhelming evidence of mental incapacity, and the trust required multiple independent medical evaluations before anyone could claim I was incompetent to manage our property. The phone conversation with Bill felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into sunlight. Frank's planning had been even more comprehensive than I'd realized, creating not just financial protections but legal strategies for fighting exactly the kind of challenge I was now facing. The man who'd spent our marriage taking care of practical matters had somehow known I'd need weapons to fight our own son's betrayal. As I prepared for bed that night, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Christmas Eve: hope. The evaluation had gone better than expected, the trust documents provided stronger protections than I'd known, and Patricia's support gave me an ally who understood the true nature of what was happening. Robert and his professionals had revealed their intentions clearly enough, but they'd also revealed the weaknesses in their case against my competence. The battle for my independence was far from over, but I was no longer fighting it alone or defenseless. Frank's final gift of legal protection was proving as valuable as 40 years of his love and support had been during our marriage. The house on Maple Street was still mine, and I intended to keep it that way. The call came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the failed evaluation. Bill Henderson's voice carried an excitement I hadn't heard since Frank was alive, the kind of energy that came from discovering something unexpected and powerful. He'd been reviewing my case files more thoroughly, cross-referencing Frank's trust documents with recent changes in California elder law, when he'd stumbled across information that would change everything about my situation. Robert had made a critical error in his campaign to gain control of my house. In his eagerness to build a case for my incompetence, he'd been secretly recording our phone conversations and saving voicemails I'd left for him and Jennifer. The recordings were intended to document my supposed confusion and declining mental state, evidence that could be used in conservatorship proceedings to prove I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. But California law was very specific about recording conversations without consent, and Robert's surveillance activities had crossed legal boundaries that transformed him from concerned son into criminal defendant. The recordings he'd intended to use against me had become evidence of his own illegal behavior, creating vulnerabilities that completely shifted the balance of power in our conflict. Bill had discovered Robert's recording activities through his own investigation into the professionals who'd conducted my evaluation. Dr. Hayes had mentioned the audio evidence during a consultation with another attorney, not realizing that secretly recorded conversations were inadmissible in court and potentially criminal under state wiretapping laws. Robert's attempt to gather ammunition against my competence had backfired spectacularly, giving me legal weapons that could destroy his credibility and expose his true motivations. The revelation felt like justice finally revealing itself after weeks of manipulation and intimidation. Robert had been so focused on proving my mental decline that he'd overlooked basic legal requirements for the evidence he was collecting. His arrogance and sense of entitlement had led him to assume that family relationships exempted him from laws designed to protect people's privacy and civil rights. Bill arranged to meet with me that afternoon to discuss legal strategies that would not only protect my independence but potentially result in criminal charges against Robert for his illegal surveillance activities. The man who'd been trying to have me declared incompetent was about to face serious legal consequences for the methods he'd used to build his case against me. Mrs. Chen was working in her garden when Bill arrived, and I could see her watching from behind her rose bushes as the distinguished older gentleman walked up my front steps carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of confident expression that suggested good news. Patricia had become my unofficial bodyguard during the past few weeks, documenting Robert and Jennifer's continued surveillance activities and serving as a witness to their escalating harassment. Bill Henderson looked exactly like what he was, a retired railroad worker who'd put himself through law school and spent 40 years helping working-class families protect themselves from people who had more money and fewer scruples. His office had been in a modest building downtown. His clients had been people like Frank and me who needed legal help but couldn't afford the fancy lawyers that wealthy people hired to solve their problems. The trust documents spread across my dining room table told a story of Frank's love and foresight that brought tears to my eyes even months after his death. Bill explained that Frank had been terrified of exactly what was happening now, worried that grief might make me vulnerable to people who would take advantage of my emotional state and advanced age. The legal protections he'd created were comprehensive and sophisticated, designed by someone who understood both human nature and legal loopholes. But the real breakthrough came when Bill opened his briefcase and pulled out transcripts of the phone conversations Robert had been secretly recording. Reading my own words, transcribed by someone who'd been violating my privacy, felt like violation on top of betrayal. But the content of the conversations completely contradicted Robert's claims about my mental state. The transcripts showed a woman who was articulate, thoughtful, and completely competent in her communication. My responses to Robert's leading questions were appropriate and measured, demonstrating exactly the kind of reasoning ability that contradicted claims about cognitive decline. The conversations revealed Robert's manipulation tactics more clearly than any professional evaluation could have documented. More damaging to Robert's case, the recordings captured him coaching Jennifer about how to document evidence of my decline, discussing strategies for building a legal case that would convince a court to grant them conservatorship authority. The conversations revealed a calculated campaign to strip me of my independence, with Robert explicitly stating that the house was worth too much money to leave in the hands of someone who might live for another 20 years. Bill had also uncovered financial records that exposed Robert's true motivations for wanting control of my property. He had been borrowing against his expectations of inheritance, taking loans and making financial commitments based on the assumption that he'd have access to my assets sooner rather than later. His pressure for me to move into a care facility wasn't about my well-being, but about his immediate need for cash that could only come from selling my house. The financial desperation added another layer to his illegal behavior, transforming what might have been seen as misguided family concern into criminal conspiracy motivated by greed. Courts took a very dim view of family members who tried to manipulate elderly relatives for financial gain, and Robert's recorded conversations provided exactly the kind of evidence that prosecutors love to present to juries. Jennifer's role in the conspiracy was also documented in the recordings, her voice captured as she discussed strategies for making me appear confused and incapable during family visits. She'd been deliberately creating stressful situations and then pointing to my reactions as evidence of declining mental capacity, a form of psychological manipulation that elder abuse specialists recognized as a common tactic used by financial predators. The most damaging recordings captured Robert and Jennifer discussing their timeline for gaining control of my house, calculating how quickly they could initiate conservatorship proceedings and complete a property sale before I could mount effective legal resistance. They'd researched real estate values and identified potential buyers, making plans for my life and property as if I were already dead. Bill explained that the illegal recordings were just the beginning of Robert's legal problems. His surveillance activities had also included hiring a private investigator to monitor my daily activities, gathering photographs and reports about my living habits that were intended to support claims about my declining capabilities. The investigation had been conducted without my knowledge or consent, potentially violating stalking laws and privacy regulations. The private investigator had documented my grocery shopping trips, medical appointments, and social activities with the thoroughness of someone building a criminal case. But instead of revealing evidence of decline or confusion, the surveillance reports showed a woman who was managing her daily life competently and independently. The investigator's own notes contradicted the narrative Robert had been trying to create about my mental state. Dr. Martinez had been contacted by the private investigator, who'd posed as a concerned family member seeking information about my medical condition and treatment needs. The attempt to access my medical records without authorization was another violation of privacy laws, adding medical fraud to the growing list of Robert's illegal activities. The scope of Robert's campaign against my independence was breathtaking in its calculation and devastating in its execution. He'd created a comprehensive strategy for isolating me from support systems, documenting evidence of decline and building legal justification for taking control of my life. The only problem was that most of his evidence-gathering activities were illegal, and the evidence he'd collected actually contradicted his claims about my incompetence. Bill had also discovered that Dr. Hayes, the psychiatrist Robert had brought to evaluate me, was facing professional disciplinary action for conducting assessments outside his licensed specialty area. His credentials to evaluate elderly patients were questionable, and his methods for gathering information about my mental state didn't meet professional standards for competency evaluations. The attorney Robert had consulted, Thomas Bradley, wasn't properly licensed to practice elder law in California, making his advice about conservatorship proceedings potentially fraudulent. The entire professional team Robert had assembled to support his case against my competence was comprised of people whose credentials and methods wouldn't withstand scrutiny in actual legal proceedings. Bill's investigation had revealed a pattern of professional misconduct and illegal activity that completely undermined Robert's credibility and exposed him to serious criminal charges. The man who'd been trying to have me declared incompetent was about to face legal consequences that could include imprisonment and financial penalties. But the most powerful evidence in my favor came from an unexpected source. Emma, my 12-year-old granddaughter, had been recording conversations at home using her smartphone, initially just practicing with the device's recording features. But she'd inadvertently captured Robert and Jennifer discussing their plans for my house and their frustration with my resistance to their recommendations. Emma's recordings revealed the ugly truth behind their concern for my welfare. Robert had told Jennifer that he was tired of waiting for me to die naturally, that keeping me in my own house was a waste of valuable real estate that could be generating income for their family. Jennifer had responded by suggesting strategies for accelerating my decline, creating stress and confusion that might hasten my need for institutional care. The child's innocent documentation of her parents' conspiracy was devastating evidence that no jury would be able to dismiss. Emma had captured them laughing about my stubborn refusal to cooperate with their plans, mocking my attachment to the house where I'd lived for 40 years, calculating the profit they'd make from selling my property once they gained legal control. Bill arranged for the recordings to be professionally transcribed and authenticated, creating legal evidence that would be admissible in both civil and criminal proceedings. Emma's documentation of her parents' true motivations provided exactly the kind of proof that would convince a court that their concern for my welfare was fraudulent and self-serving. The legal strategy Bill proposed was aggressive and comprehensive, designed to not only protect my independence but ensure that Robert faced consequences for his illegal activities. We would file criminal complaints about his unauthorized recordings and privacy violations, civil lawsuits for attempted fraud and elder abuse, and professional complaints against Dr. Hayes and Bradley for their unethical conduct. More importantly, Bill would petition the court for a restraining order that would prevent Robert and Jennifer from contacting me or coming near my property. Their pattern of harassment and intimidation qualified as elder abuse under California law, creating legal grounds for protecting me from further manipulation and threats. The restraining order would also prevent them from accessing information about my medical care, financial affairs, or legal decisions. Their campaign to gather evidence about my competence would be legally prohibited, giving me privacy and peace that I hadn't experienced since their intervention began. Bill explained that Robert's financial desperation made him particularly dangerous, since people facing economic ruin often escalated their illegal behavior when initial strategies failed. The restraining order would provide immediate protection while criminal and civil proceedings moved through the courts, ensuring my safety during what could be a lengthy legal battle. The next morning, Patricia knocked on my door with news that felt like Christmas morning arriving early. She'd been contacted by Tyler, my 10-year-old grandson, who'd been troubled by conversations he'd overheard between his parents about plans for my house. The boy had been raised to respect his elders and couldn't understand why his parents were saying mean things about his grandmother. Tyler had called Patricia directly, having remembered her phone number from previous visits to my house. He wanted to know whether I was really sick like his parents said, because I seemed perfectly normal to him during family visits. His innocence and loyalty provided another witness who could testify about Robert and Jennifer's manipulation tactics and their campaign to create false impressions about my mental state. The children's involvement in documenting their parents' conspiracy felt like poetic justice, innocent honesty exposing adult corruption and greed. Emma and Tyler had provided evidence that no professional evaluation could contradict, their recordings and observations revealing the truth behind Robert's facade of concerned family member. Bill had also been investigating Jennifer's background, discovering that she'd been involved in similar situations with her own elderly relatives. Her grandmother had been forced into a nursing home under questionable circumstances, with Jennifer gaining control of property and assets that other family members believed had been obtained through manipulation and fraud. The pattern of elder abuse surrounding Jennifer suggested that her involvement in my situation wasn't just supporting her husband's plans, but bringing her own expertise in exploiting elderly relatives for financial gain. Her knowledge of conservatorship procedures and manipulation tactics appeared to come from previous experience stripping older family members of their independence and assets. Court documents from Jennifer's previous cases were sealed, but Bill had found enough public record information to establish a pattern of concerning behavior around elderly relatives. The information wouldn't be admissible in criminal proceedings, but it would be relevant in civil cases and could be used to demonstrate her predatory intentions toward me. The legal filings Bill prepared were comprehensive and devastating, presenting evidence of a criminal conspiracy to defraud an elderly woman of her property and independence. The documents detailed Robert's illegal surveillance activities, Jennifer's manipulation tactics, and the coordinated campaign they'd waged to undermine my credibility and create false evidence of incompetence. The civil lawsuit sought damages for emotional distress, invasion of privacy, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. The financial penalties Robert and Jennifer would face if we prevailed in court would be substantial, potentially including punitive damages designed to deter similar behavior by other potential elder abusers. But more satisfying than financial compensation was the prospect of public exposure for their criminal behavior. Court proceedings would create public records documenting their attempt to steal my house and strip me of my independence, ensuring that their reputation in the community would reflect the true nature of their character. The restraining order was granted immediately after Bill presented evidence of Robert's illegal recordings and the threatening nature of his recent communications. The court found that Robert and Jennifer had engaged in a pattern of harassment and intimidation that qualified as elder abuse, creating immediate legal protections for me. The order prohibited them from contacting me directly or indirectly, coming within 500 yards of my property, or attempting to gather information about my personal affairs through third parties. Violation of the restraining order would result in immediate arrest and criminal charges, giving me legal weapons that would stop their harassment immediately. When the sheriff's deputy served the restraining order at Robert's house, neighbors witnessed the humiliating scene of my son being legally prohibited from contacting his own mother. The public nature of his legal troubles began the process of exposing his true character to the community that had previously seen him as a successful businessman and devoted family member. Jennifer's reaction to the restraining order was immediate and telling. She began calling mutual friends and distant relatives, claiming that I was having a mental breakdown and had been manipulated by unscrupulous lawyers into making false accusations against my loving family. Her desperate attempts to control the narrative only reinforced the evidence of her manipulative nature and predatory intentions. The criminal investigation proceeded rapidly once Bill presented evidence of Robert's illegal recordings to the district attorney's office. Wiretapping laws in California were taken seriously by prosecutors, especially when the violations involved elderly victims and financial motivations. The DA assigned an experienced prosecutor who specialized in elder abuse cases, understanding the complex dynamics that made older adults vulnerable to family predators. Robert's arrest came 3 weeks after the restraining order was served, police officers arriving at his workplace to take him into custody on charges of illegal surveillance, invasion of privacy, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. The public nature of his arrest ensured that his professional reputation would suffer, along with his legal standing, career consequences that felt like appropriate punishment for his betrayal. The news coverage of Robert's arrest focused on the illegal recording activities and his attempt to manipulate conservatorship proceedings for financial gain. Local media portrayed the case as an example of adult children who prey on elderly parents, using the story to educate the public about warning signs of family-based elder abuse. Reading about my son's criminal charges in the morning newspaper felt surreal, like discovering that someone I thought I knew had been living a secret life as a completely different person. The man described in the articles bore my son's name and history, but displayed character traits that seemed foreign to everything I'd believed about the child I'd raised. But the news coverage also felt vindicating, public acknowledgement that my resistance to their plans had been justified, and that my insistence on maintaining my independence had been reasonable rather than stubborn. The community that might have seen me as a confused elderly woman refusing appropriate help now understood that I'd been defending myself against criminal conspiracy. Mrs. Chen became something of a neighborhood celebrity, interviewed by reporters about her role in supporting my fight against family predators. Her articulate explanations of elder abuse tactics and her passionate defense of my competence and independence made her an effective advocate for elderly rights in general. The legal victory felt complete when Dr. Hayes lost his medical license for conducting evaluations outside his area of expertise and accepting payment for fraudulent assessments. His professional destruction served as a warning to other doctors who might be tempted to participate in elder abuse schemes disguised as medical interventions. Thomas Bradley faced disbarment proceedings for practicing outside his licensed areas and providing fraudulent legal advice designed to facilitate elder abuse. The destruction of the professional team Robert had assembled to support his case demonstrated that the entire conspiracy had been built on illegal foundations. But the most satisfying vindication came from an unexpected source. The senior living facility that Jennifer had researched for my placement contacted me directly, having learned about the case through news coverage. They'd been appalled to discover that their facility had been part of Robert's criminal conspiracy, used as a tool for his financial manipulation rather than legitimate care planning. The facility's administrator explained that they'd received numerous suspicious inquiries about forced placements and family members seeking to institutionalize elderly relatives against their will. Robert and Jennifer's approach had been a red flag that they'd reported to authorities, adding their documentation to the evidence of criminal conspiracy. The administrator invited me to tour their facility, not because I needed placement, but because they wanted me to see the difference between legitimate care planning and the fraudulent manipulation Robert had attempted. The visit reinforced my understanding that appropriate senior living arrangements were based on individual choice rather than family pressure. As winter turned to spring, my house on Maple Street began to feel like home again, rather than a fortress under siege. The legal protections Bill had secured ensured that I could live independently without fear of harassment or manipulation from family members who confused their financial needs with my welfare. The garden Frank had planted began to bloom with the persistence of life asserting itself after a hard winter, roses and fruit trees showing no awareness of the human drama that had played out beneath their branches. The normalcy of seasonal change felt healing after months of legal and emotional turmoil. Emma and Tyler had been allowed supervised visits once the court determined that my grandchildren were innocent victims of their parents' criminal behavior. The children's relief at discovering that their grandmother wasn't sick or confused was touching, their natural affection uncomplicated by the adult motivations that had poisoned their parents' relationship with me. The house that Robert had tried to steal remained mine, its ownership now protected by legal victories that would prevent future challenges to my independence. Frank's planning had proven prescient, his trust documents providing exactly the weapons I'd needed to fight a battle he'd somehow known I might face. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I discovered that age and widowhood didn't automatically make me vulnerable to predators who wore familiar faces and spoke the language of love while planning betrayal. The grandmother Robert had tried to control had proven stronger and more resourceful than he'd imagined possible. 2 years have passed since that Christmas Eve when my son locked me out of my own house, and the woman who stands in my kitchen today bears little resemblance to the isolated widow Robert thought he could manipulate into surrendering her independence. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but grew slowly like Frank's oak tree, putting down deep roots that would be impossible to uproot. The criminal trial proceedings became a media sensation that extended far beyond Riverside, with news outlets across California covering the case as an example of how family predators target elderly relatives for financial gain. Robert received 2 years in state prison for wiretapping violations and attempted elder abuse, while Jennifer was sentenced to 18 months for conspiracy and fraud. Their convictions created legal precedents that would protect other elderly Californians from similar family-based exploitation. But my real transformation began not with their sentencing, but with my decision to use my experience to help other elderly people who were facing similar threats from family members who confused their inheritance expectations with immediate entitlements. The calls started coming within weeks of the news coverage, desperate voices of grandmothers and grandfathers who recognized their own situations in my story. Mrs. Chen suggested that I consider turning my dining room into an informal counseling center, a place where elderly people could come to discuss their family situations with someone who understood the complex emotions involved in fighting your own children for the right to control your own life. The idea felt overwhelming initially, but the steady stream of visitors convinced me that my experience had value beyond my personal vindication. The Mae Thompson Center for Elder Independence began as nothing more than a kitchen table where I served coffee to frightened seniors who needed someone to listen to their stories without judgment or assumption. Within 6 months, it had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization with volunteer attorneys, social workers, and counselors who specialized in protecting elderly people from family predators. Bill Henderson emerged from retirement to serve as our legal director, his railroad pension, and Frank's careful estate planning, providing the financial foundation for an organization that charged no fees for its services. Patricia Chen became our community outreach coordinator, her teacher background, perfect for educating people about warning signs of elder abuse and legal protections available to potential victims. The center operates out of the sunroom Frank added to our house 15 years ago, the space filled with comfortable chairs and legal resources that help families navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of aging without surrendering autonomy to adult children who mistake control for care. We've helped hundreds of elderly Californians protect their independence while maintaining healthy relationships with family members who respect their choices. Emma and Tyler visit every other weekend now, court-supervised visits that have evolved into genuine relationships, unmarked by their parents' criminal manipulation. The children have been attending family therapy sessions, designed to help them understand what happened and why their grandmother had to fight their parents in court. Their resilience and capacity for forgiveness continue to amaze me, proof that innocence can survive even the most toxic family dynamics. My grandchildren have become unofficial ambassadors for the center, talking to their school friends about respecting elderly relatives and recognizing warning signs of elder abuse. Emma, now 14, wrote an essay about her experience that won a statewide contest on social justice topics. Tyler, 12, volunteers at the center by helping elderly visitors feel comfortable while they wait for appointments. The house on Maple Street has been restored to its full glory, Frank's deferred maintenance projects finally completed with money from the civil lawsuit settlement Robert and Jennifer were forced to pay for their attempted fraud. The wraparound porch has been rebuilt, the hardwood floors refinished, the Victorian details Frank loved carefully preserved and enhanced. But more than physical restoration, the house has been transformed from a target of greed into a sanctuary for people fighting to maintain their dignity and independence in the face of family pressure. The kitchen where Robert and Jennifer once plotted my institutionalization now hosts support group meetings where elderly people share strategies for protecting themselves from manipulation and financial exploitation. The legal victories established important precedents that strengthened California's elder protection laws, making it more difficult for family members to use conservatorship proceedings as weapons for financial gain. Bill worked with state legislators to close loopholes that had allowed people like Robert to exploit legal systems designed to protect vulnerable adults rather than enable family predators. My testimony before the state legislature about my experience with family-based elder abuse helped pass new laws requiring multiple independent evaluations before conservatorship proceedings can be initiated, giving elderly people more opportunities to defend themselves against false claims of incompetence. The legislation was named the Frank Thompson Elder Protection Act, honoring the man whose estate planning had provided the legal weapons I'd needed to fight my son's betrayal. Dr. Martinez has become the center's medical advisor, helping elderly people understand their rights to make their own healthcare decisions and resist pressure from family members who want to control their medical care. Her expertise in geriatric medicine provides professional credibility that helps counter false claims about age-related incompetence and declining cognitive abilities. The center has expanded beyond individual counseling to include educational workshops about estate planning, legal rights, and family communication strategies that can prevent conflicts before they escalate to legal battles. We teach elderly people how to protect themselves financially while maintaining relationships with family members who respect their autonomy and independence. Our most successful program pairs elderly people with volunteer advocates who provide ongoing support and friendship, creating social connections that reduce isolation and provide witnesses to cognitive competence that family predators often try to undermine. The program recognizes that loneliness and social isolation make elderly people more vulnerable to manipulation by relatives who exploit emotional needs for controlling purposes. The transformation in my own daily life has been equally dramatic. Instead of spending my evenings alone with memories of Frank, I'm surrounded by people who value my experience and wisdom, elderly peers who've faced similar challenges, and younger volunteers who respect what we've survived and accomplished. The isolation Robert and Jennifer had used against me has been replaced by community connections that enrich rather than drain my energy. I've discovered that helping other people fight for their independence has given my own struggle broader meaning and purpose. The pain of my son's betrayal has been transformed into motivation for protecting other elderly people from similar family predators, turning personal trauma into social activism that creates positive change for vulnerable populations. The speaking engagements that followed the media coverage have taken me across California, sharing my story with senior centers, legal organizations, and family service agencies that work with elderly populations. The response has been overwhelming, with audience members frequently approaching me afterward to share their own experiences with family manipulation and financial exploitation. Writing my memoir about the experience has been therapeutic and practical, creating a resource that other elderly people can use to understand their rights and options when facing pressure from family members who mistake their inheritance expectations for immediate entitlements. The book has become a bestseller in the elder care field, generating royalties that support the center's operations. The relationship with my son remains permanently severed, a choice that once would have broken my heart but now feels like necessary protection from someone who proved capable of criminal behavior, motivated by greed and impatience. Some losses are actually gains when they remove toxic influences that masquerade as family love while pursuing selfish agendas. Jennifer's attempts to reconcile after her release from prison have been consistently rejected, her letters claiming remorse and requesting forgiveness ignored by someone who understands that true repentance requires acknowledging harm rather than minimizing consequences. Her continued attempts to contact me through third parties resulted in additional restraining orders that will remain in effect permanently. The financial security Frank's planning provided has been enhanced by lawsuit settlements and book royalties, creating resources that support both my independence and the center's mission to protect other elderly people from family predators. Money that Robert had hoped to inherit through manipulation and fraud now funds programs that prevent similar exploitation of vulnerable seniors. My daily routine includes morning walks through the neighborhood where I've lived for over 40 years, conversations with neighbors who respect my choices and independence, and afternoons spent counseling elderly people who need someone to validate their right to control their own lives. The schedule is busy but fulfilling, structured around activities that matter, rather than empty time that invites depression and isolation. The garden Frank planted continues to flourish under my care, seasonal changes marking the passage of time in ways that feel natural rather than threatening. The roses he loved bloom more vibrantly each spring, their persistence reminding me that beautiful things can survive harsh conditions and emerge stronger after difficult seasons. Evening hours are spent reading in Frank's old chair, the furniture finally feeling like comfort rather than shrine to loss. The books that fill our shelves include legal resources, elder advocacy materials, and memoirs by other people who've transformed personal trauma into social activism that benefits vulnerable populations. The oak tree Frank planted the day we moved to Maple Street has grown into the neighborhood landmark he'd envisioned, providing shade for grandchildren who play beneath its branches and shelter for birds that nest in its strong limbs. The tree has become a symbol of endurance and growth, proof that some things become more valuable and beautiful with age. Mrs. Chen remains my closest friend and strongest ally, her daily presence, a reminder that true family consists of people who support your choices rather than trying to control your decisions. Our friendship has deepened through shared activism, working together to protect elderly people who need advocates willing to fight against family predators and institutional indifference. The center has received recognition from state and national organizations focused on elder rights, awards that validate our approach to empowering elderly people rather than simply providing services that might inadvertently increase their dependence on others. The recognition has brought additional funding and volunteer support that allows us to help more people. Looking back at the woman I was before that Christmas Eve confrontation, I can see how grief and isolation had made me vulnerable to manipulation by people who exploited my emotional needs for controlling purposes. But the fighting back revealed strength and resources I hadn't known I possessed, capabilities that age had refined rather than diminished. The house on Maple Street stands as proof that elderly people can successfully defend themselves against family predators when they have access to legal protections, community support, and the determination to fight for their independence. The home Robert tried to steal has become a fortress of elder empowerment, protecting not just my autonomy but serving as a beacon for other elderly people who refuse to surrender their dignity. At 75, I've never been more purposeful or powerful, my life enriched by meaningful work and authentic relationships that respect my choices and independence. The transformation from isolated widow to community leader happened gradually, but the change has been profound and permanent. Frank's memory lives on not just in the house we shared, but in the legal protections he created, and the organization his planning made possible. His love continues to shield me from harm while empowering me to protect other elderly people from family members who confuse inheritance expectations with immediate entitlements. The grandmother Robert tried to control has become a force for social change, living proof that age brings wisdom and strength, rather than automatic vulnerability to manipulation by younger relatives who mistake their temporary advantage for permanent authority. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.